want to thank you for organizing the meeting. It's not me. I think Elias did the work. He requested the meeting. So basically, as a way of background, is that even prior to the party resolutions, last year, the last session of Parliament, you recall that when we were amending the Electoral Act, a lot of issues came up when we were debating the Electoral Act, Amendment Act, where certain issues to deal with the voters' roll became topical in the National Assembly. Issues to do with delimitation also became topical. You recall that were it not for the constitutional requirement that ZEC can proceed, the National Assembly, I think they had not given its nod to the delimitation processes and the conflation of roles where ZEC became the responsible authority in terms of delimitation, then became the one that implements what they've done, and carrying with them the same players from delimitation to election creates grounds for friction, and hence that was one of the agreements. And then what then happened is the ruling party, through its structures, they also came up with issues that they felt needed to be addressed in terms of the requisite legislative amendments that may be necessary to effect that, against a background of we also had 2 years of COVID. We had a developmental trajectory where we have a mantra that we must build our own country on the basis of our own agreement, not on the basis of what we are told by foreigners. The ruling party, in its wisdom, then directed the party and government to institute those necessary amendments to the Constitution. Having given that background, what I decided to do for your benefit is to crystallize my remarks in a statement which I can then circulate, and then you'll be able not to rely on recordings but on what we prepared, so that you can then use that. So I will read that. I'm profoundly grateful for this opportunity to engage with you on the profound motivations and substance content of the Constitution of Zimbabwe, Amendment No. 3 Bill 2026, a visionary legislative instrument approved by Cabinet on 10 February and gazetted by the Speaker of the National Assembly this past Monday, thereby inaugurating a robust 90-day period of public consultations commencing on Tuesday, 17 February. This dialogue is not merely an exchange of information, it is a clarion call for collective stewardship of our nation's constitutional destiny. At its core, the Constitution of Zimbabwe, Amendment No. 3 Bill, transcends narrow confines of partisan agendas, embodying instead a suite of institutional reforms that are unassailably robust, historically transformative, and resolutely oriented towards future generations, all unequivocally in service to the supreme national interest. The bill stands as a cohesive, meticulously evidence-based antidote to the entrenched governance impediments that have afflicted Zimbabwe for over 3 decades. Critically informed by judicial precedents, resonant societal aspirations, and illuminating comparative experiences across Africa. So we find out that in the bill we looked at experiences in other countries. We also looked at some of the judgments that were passed to help us come up with a clear path, and also our experiences as a nation. In targeted and resolute fashion, the bill seeks the eradication of the pernicious barriers that have undermined our governance framework since the introduction of direct presidential elections in 1990, which were sent from 2000 onwards. These include the recurrent spectra of disputed electoral conduct and outcomes, the insidious cycles of perpetual electioneering that diverts precious resources from policy execution and developmental imperatives, most notably infrastructural advancements, and the corrosive triad of corruption, inefficiency, and societal polarization. Such maladies have exerted a staggering toll, with estimates from authoritative bodies like the World Bank, IMF, Africa Union, and SADC chronicling a loss of US 150 to 200 billion in unrealized potential between the year 2000 and 2023. It is imperative that we confront and correct this legacy of stagnation with bold, decisive action. Yet, but let me read it. This bill is anchored firmly in the binding judicial wisdom of Max Mapungu versus Minister of Justice, Legal and Parliamentary Affairs, which astutely delineates term length provisions, such as age limits in Section 186, subsection 2, or terms of office in Section 95, subsection 2, which are amenable to amendment by 2/3 parliamentary majority under Section 328, subsection 5, from immutable term limit caps like those in Section 91, subsection 2, or 216, subsection 3, which alone necessitate referendums pursuant to Section 328, subsection 7. This distinction is not merely academic, it is the bedrock of constitutional integrity. It is incontrovertible that the genesis of this bill traces to the 2024 resolution number 1 of the majority party in parliament, that, and I quote, the President and First Secretary of ZANU-PF, His Excellency, Comrade Dr. Edim Mnangagwa's term of office as President of the Republic of Zimbabwe and First Secretary of ZANU-PF be extended beyond 2028 to 2030. The party and government should therefore set in motion the necessary amendments to the national constitution so as to give effect to this resolution, unquote. Yet, upon escalation to government, our unwavering focus crystallized on the operative imperative, and I quote, government should set in motion the necessary amendments to the national constitution so as to give effect to this resolution, unquote. This mandate compelled an unyielding commitment to constitutional fidelity above all else, and in this solemn pursuit, we deemed it an absolute imperative to safeguard two cornerstone provisions of the Constitution of Zimbabwe. 1, Section 91, subsection 2, and I quote, a person is disqualified for election as president or appointment as vice president if he or she has already held office as president under this Constitution for 2 terms, whether continuous or not, and for the purposes of this subsection, 3 or more years' service is deemed to be a full term, unquote. To tamper with this would invite perceptions of partisanship or of personal aggrandizement, which we resolutely reject. And then we have section 328, subsection 7. And I quote, an amendment to a term limit provision, the effect of which is to extend the length of time, I want to repeat, the length of time that a person may hold or occupy any public office does not apply in relation to any person who held or occupied that office or an equivalent office at any time before the amendment, unquote. In instance, we elected to uphold the presidential term limit in its entirety, refraining from any alteration to section 91, subsection 2, or any facet of section 328, particularly subsection 7. This principled stance underscores our dedication to enduring democratic reforms. I will explain later what I mean by these sections. Our deliberations were profoundly shaped by the stark realities impending the realization of Vision 2030, which was launched in October 2018, exacerbated by disruptions such as the 2-year setback inflicted by COVID-19 on the National Development Strategy 1, which was launched in October 2020, also compounded by the venomous undercurrents of perpetual electioneering, vividly exemplified by the violent demonstrations of January 2019 and July 2020. These exigencies forge an irrefutable case. Zimbabwe's prevailing 5-year election cycle is manifestly insufficient to foster the odious infrastructure-centric and delivery-oriented governance essential to Vision 2030, NDS 1 and NDS 2. Since 2000, the short five-year cycle has ensnared our nation in a debilitating perpetual election mode, wherein political actors prioritize rancorous division of a substantive service delivery, endangering contested elections, policy paralysis, rampant corruption, operational inefficiencies, and profound societal cleavages. This bill emerges as a courageous corrective poised to unlock sustained advancement and national rejuvenation, propelling us triumphantly towards and beyond 2030. It is crucial to understand that the 5-year length or term of office articulated in section 95, subsection 2, constitutes an institutional election cycle. I want to repeat. If you go to section 95, subsection 2b, it's not ascribed to an individual. It's an institutional election cycle. In other words, it says, if you are elected a president, whether you are still there or not, if the election happened in 2023, that cycle will end in 2028. So if the current president is to vacate, the new one will not start his own term or his own cycle. It will be the cycle. So it's not a term limit in that it's not ascribed to the individual, but to the office. That is, in instance, what section 95, subsection 2b says. I thought I should explain that. So it is crucial, I will repeat, to understand that the 5-year length or term of office articulated in section 95, subsection 2b constitutes an institutional election cycle wholly detached from the tenure of an individual president and thus independent to the office holder. Under our constitution, The president leads the elected executive. Members of parliament comprise the elected legislature, and judges are appointed. Elections are synchronized under section 158 subsection 1 and harmonized in section 158 subsection 2 with the 5-year election cycle outlined in sections 95 subsection 2b, 143 subsection 1 and 158 subsection 1. This intricate interdependence necessitates reforms that address these provisions governing Zimbabwe's election cycle. A deliberate framework encompassing campaigning, voter mobilization, electoral processes between general elections, erroneously portrayed by detractors as term limit provisions. Section 95 subsection 2b is in truth an unambiguous election cycle clause that prescribes the institutional duration or term length of the presidency. Its language is unequivocal, election-oriented, and I will quote it. The term of office of the president extends until, I go to B, following an election, he or she is declared to be elected, or a new president is declared to be elected. So in other words, the term of office of a president does not stop after a specific time frame. It ends when the tenure ends, when he is re-elected and a new term of office starts, or a new president who has been elected is sworn in. So there's no vacuum. In other words, I always give this example, that if we go to an election and the president-elect for some reason collapses and dies, the president who is there will organize another election and continue exercising the authority of the president until another one is elected and sworn in. Whereas if you go to a term limit provision, if he is appointed a permanent secretary, the clock starts ticking in. If he resigns, one who is appointed does not continue his term. He will start his own. Whereas the electoral cycle, when an MP is elected, if an MP resigns or dies or is recalled, you join the electoral cycle and you finish the remainder. If a president is removed, you join the electoral cycle and you finish what is remaining. But the actual term limit provision in 91 then says it becomes personal to the holder. Says if you want to be a president, you must not have served more than 2 terms. It now joins the cycle. If you serve a term, and it now says 3 or more years is deemed, is now deemed a term. In other words, it's giving a minimum, it's not giving an upper cap. Why is it not giving an upper cap? In order not to create a vacuum? Because the vacation from office of a president is dependent on several factors. So I thought I could explain that, so that those that go to town about what we are trying to do is to extend the term. If the president wants to subject himself to another election, the qualification to be a president will then kick in. The ones that we said we uphold the fidelity of the Constitution, we are not touching. So in 2030, if he says, I want to subject my CV for an election, then the Electoral Commission will say, how many terms have you served? You served from 2018 to 2023. From 2023, in terms of this provision, you are disqualified. That's how that's the reading of it. Let me go back to where I was. Yes. So I will repeat from here. The term of office of the president extends until, following an election, he or she is declared to be re-elected or a new president is declared to be elected. This privileges electoral renewal over personal term restrictions. Moreover, Section 95, subsection 2, explicitly frames the presidential term of office, election cycles, as 5 years and conterminous with the life of parliament, deliberately intertwining presidential and parliamentary durations or periods to affirm its role as an electoral mechanism, not a term limit, thus debunking fallacious interpretations with unassailable clarity. In this light, Section 95, subsection 2b establishes a standardized duration for the president as an enduring institution, ensuring administrative continuity and a rhythmic 5-year electoral cadence without imposing cumulative constraints on incumbents. This demarcation sharply distinguishes it from authentic term limits, which enforce inflexible caps with a specific beginning and a determinable end. The provision accommodates successive holders within a single cycle without reset, prioritizing institutional stability. For instance, in the event of resignation or removal after 3 years, a presidential successor inherits only the remaining 2 years under Section 101, as exemplified by His Excellency President Mnangagwa in 2017, who seamlessly completed President Mugabe's term without getting a fresh 5-year term when he assumed office on November 24, 2017. Amending Section 95, subsection 2b to replace 5 years with 7 years, augmented by a proviso for seamless continuity from 4 September 2023 to 4 September 2030, eschews any personalization of President Mnangagwa's tenure under Section 91, subsection 2. Instead, it strategically extends the institutional election cycle in harmony with Parliament, fully consonant and compliant with the Mpungu precedent. This rationale extends with equal force to the amendment of Section 143, subsection 1, an election cycle provision entitled Duration and Dissolution of Parliament, intrinsically aligned with the presidential election cycle under Section 95, subsection 2b. Zimbabwe's parliaments have been sequentially enumerated according to election cycles since 1980, with the current 10th parliament commencing on the 4th of September. In other words, I'm sure you've noticed that our parliaments, we've enumerated them according to the election cycle. The first parliament in 1980 was the first parliament of Zimbabwe. The second, now we are on our 10th parliament. So you realize that when the president comes to give the State of the Nation address, we'll say he's addressing the third session of the 10th parliament, meaning it's the third year of the tenure of that particular parliament. Standing Order 44 mandates annual State of the Nation address to inaugurate sessions, while Standing Order 46 stipulates 5 sessions per parliament, mirroring the 5-year election cycle. Historical context illuminates this framework. The Lancaster House Constitution instituted 5-year election cycles, yet Amendment number 18 of 2007 abbreviated the 5th Parliament to align with the presidential election cycle exemplifying constitutional adaptability. In other words, I'm saying, if you remember the Constitution Amendment 18 of 2007, we wanted to harmonize the tenure of the presidents with that of parliament. You recall we had a 6-year tenure of president and we had a 5-year tenure of parliament. So what we did is we then had to cut the parliamentary term by 2 years to align, and we brought forward elections for parliamentarians to 2008 to align with that of the president. And then we harmonized to say that the lifespan of parliament is now 5 years, the lifespan of the president is now 5 years. And so this is not the first time that we are doing this. We did it in 2007 when we reduced the presidential term from 6 to 7. The 2013 Constitution perpetuates this structure with Section 95, subsection 2b, accommodating exigencies such as resignation, death and dissolution, impeachment, or a vote of no confidence. Accordingly, amending Section 143, subsection 1, to institute a 7-year duration or term length complements the amendment to Section 95, subsection 2b, and is validated by the Mupungu precedent. Section 158, subsection 1, reinforces this by requiring elections before Parliament's expiry or dissolution, affirming that Sections 95, subsection 2b and 143 are election cycle mechanisms, not term limit provisions. Section 95, subsection 2b, Section 143, subsection 1, and Section 158, subsection 1 harmonize impeccably with Section 91, subsection 2, which defines a full term as 3 or more years, without constraining the election cycle's length, thereby facilitating the 7-year paradigm. In summation, and this merits emphatic reiteration, amending Section 95, subsection 2b. In other words, it will preserve the presidential term limit in terms of Section 91, subsection 2. We're not altering that. In other words, any president will serve 2 terms per the provisions of Section 91, subsection 2. 4 clauses, any prospect of a 3rd term or a repeal of the presidential term limit. We're not touching that, leaving it as it is. Anyone who aspires to be president, the presidential 2-term limit is still there. Nobody touched it. Not even the current president, he never touched it. He stuck to what he said. I'm a constitutionalist. What the Constitution directs me to do, that's what I will do. It elongates the electoral cycle from 5 to 7 years. That's all it's doing, to elongate the election cycle from 5 to 7 for everyone, from councillors to the president. But it's not specific to a person. It's the office of the president, like I said earlier on. And it encompasses all elective offices, including parliamentarian positions, beyond merely the president. And it ensures that under Section 95, subsection 2b, a successor pursuant to Section 101 arising from resignation, removal, or death after, say, 3 years, assumes solely the residual election cycle duration, fostering continuity without commencing a new term, analogous to parliamentary by-elections under Section 143, subsection 1, that replenish only the remaining cycle or period, in contrast to Section 216, subsection 2, for defense commanders, where vacancies initiate fresh 5-year terms. In other words, if you look at the permanent secretary provision or the commander of the defense forces in terms of Section 216, if the commander of defense forces resigns and another one is appointed, you don't say, no, the one that resigned had served 2 years, so you are serving 3 years. You don't do that. It's a fresh, it's person specific. You get your own appointment with a specific determinable starting date and a specific determinable end date, which is different from the parliamentary and the presidential tenure. And it operates within Section 328's amendment regimen, mandating referendums only for Chapter 4. In other words, referendums are mandated for Chapter 4, that is the Declaration of Rights, Chapter 16, which speaks about agricultural land, or Section 328 itself, because the Constitution says if you want to amend Section 328 provisions, you need now a referendum, as if you were amending Chapter 4. Notably, amendments to term limit provisions do not intrinsically require referendums, as Section 91 subsection 2 endures unaltered, while Section 95 subsection 2b and 143 subsection 1 are exempt as election cycles. So these ones are election cycles, the ones that we are amending. We are not touching term limit provisions. We are dealing with electoral cycle provisions, not one that are specific to an individual, where if you subject yourself to an election, it becomes specific to you to say, are you 40 years? Are you a citizen? Are you ordinarily resident in Zimbabwe? Have you been a president? That's the question. It's specific to you. Then the question is, have you been a president? You say yes. How many terms have you served? Then they do the mathematics. And then they say 3 or more years. So if you inherit somebody's term after 1 year, tenure, someone is elected to this year, next year, if a case office, you inherit and you do 4 years, then you say, okay, you served 4, we take. For the purposes of this section, it's deemed a full term, you served another. Did you seek re-election? Yes. And you were re-elected? Yes. And you served how many years? I served, but I then resigned after 4 years. For the purposes of this, it's a term, therefore you are disqualified. But we are dealing with electoral cycle provisions, which we are saying, what electoral cycles do we need? And we are saying we want an electoral cycle of 7 years. And we are not touching the term limit provision. We are leaving it like that. And therefore, we are not, there is no need for us to go to a referendum, because we are not touching Chapter 4. We are not touching Chapter 16, agricultural land. We are not even tampering with Section 328 as it were. So let me go on. So we have observed that there are those that are peddling misinformation surrounding the gazetted amendment to Section 95, subsection 2b, including baseless claims that it necessitates a national referendum as an alleged term limit provision. These assertions, as I have alluded to, are profoundly misguided and demand an equivocal repudiation. I think I've tried to unpack our thinking when we did the bill. The constitutional amendment architecture is lucidly prescribed in Section 328. Pivotal is Section 328, subsection 6, which requires a referendum only for bills altering provisions in Chapter 4. That is the Declaration of Rights, or Chapter 16, which is agricultural land, or Section 328, subsection 9, extends this safeguard to itself, to Section 328, equating it to Chapter 4, like what I said, that if you want to amend Section 328, you do the same as if you were amending Chapter 4. So it's insulated from the amendment. Thus, only these delimited segments demand 2/3 parliamentary endorsement, followed by a referendum, nothing further. Those two, when you're amending Chapter 4, Chapter 16, and Section 328. If you touch a term limit provision? You don't need. If I decided that I want to touch the term limit provision to say we now need 3 terms, we don't need a referendum. The only thing that we need is the incumbent will be told, oh no, it says if you want to, you can't benefit because there is a provision that you must not benefit, but it doesn't warrant a referendum. So we didn't even change the terms. We left them as 2. But assuming we had changed, still we didn't need a referendum. What it would simply do is it would disqualify those that the incumbent. But it would not disqualify Seva Mugabe if he was there. Because he's not the incumbent. I'm sure it's very clear. Contrary to politically motivated fabrications masquerading as legal analysis, amendments to term limit provisions do not invariably invoke referendums. Our Constitution enumerates 15 provisions, none inherently shielded, permitting their revision without a referendum, save where Section 328, subsection 7 intervenes if incumbents benefit from a term limit extension. From this exposition, several imperatives emerge with crystalline clarity. 1, the presidential term limit in Section 91, subsection 2 remains unamended. 2, all 15 term limit provisions are amenable to amendment without referendum. In other words, if we want to change the term limit for the Commander Defense Forces, we'll change it and go and solicit 2/3 majority in Parliament. We don't need a referendum. If we want to change the term limit provisions for permanent secretaries, we don't need a referendum. The only thing that it does disqualifies the incumbent. So Nyemba kanga serve 2 terms. In fact, Nyemba anenga hakunza iwo kandiwo incumbent kayo. Ikuti kaiwa ugone kuningirwa. But it doesn't warrant kutende ku referendum. So I don't know where this referendum friends is coming from. And I'm going to hype. Sections 95, subsection 2b, and section 143, subsection 1 constitute election cycle provisions, not term limits, thereby exempting them from referendum obligations. If you go and check the Lancaster House Constitution, it's exactly worded like section 95. And we never had to re-elect. Election it's the wording is the same. The one that we then introduced as a term limit provision is on qualifications to be elected, where we said when you now want to subject yourself, we then ask specific person-specific questions. What is your age? Are you a citizen? Are you permanent resident? Have you been a president? And then we tick the boxes. The litmus test for section 95 subsection 2b resides in section 328 subsection 1's definition of a term limit provision as, and I quote, a provision of this constitution which limits the length of time that a person, not an office, that a person, it becomes specific to you, may hold or occupy a public office, unquote. If affirmative, section 328 subsection 7 applies with referendum ramifications. If negative, no referendum ensues. In other words, if you want to change it and you want it to benefit them, then you might need to go to a referendum. But if you don't want and the incumbent to benefit, in which case we have already declared that we want the two-term provision to stay. We didn't touch it. So we cannot go for a referendum when we have not changed the qualification for the president. Section 328, subsection 7 triggers a referendum solely if a term limit amendment prolongs an incumbent's tenure for one who occupied the office pre-amendment. In other words, if we had amended and we say we want a third term, and we want the incumbent to benefit, then we need a referendum. But in our amendment, we have never mentioned that. If you go and read it, nowhere where we are seeking that we want the president to have a third term. This precision mandates unwavering allegiance to constitutional verity over partisan speculation. Inextricably intertwined with the amendments to sections 95, 143, 158 is the repeal and substitution of section 92, transitioning from direct popular election of the president to indirect election by parliament. Yeah, listen to this. This paradigm shifting reform revives the sagacious pre-1987 Lancaster House model, wherein the executive derives from parliamentary majorities, fostering consensus and eradicating the glint of disputed elections. The 1987 Constitutional Amendment No. 7 disrupted this equilibrium by establishing a directly elected executive president with a 6-year cycle decoupled from Parliament's 5-year term, precipitating bifurcated elections and persistent toxicities since 1990. Widespread political violence, contested outcomes, and insidious regime change plots. Even Amendment No. 18 of 2007, which harmonized cycles to 5 years and synchronized elections for the president, parliament, and local authorities, failed to remove this. Direct presidential elections, in their nature, they cause a lot of toxicities as the perennial catalyst for disputes consistently decried by observers from the AU, SADC, and Commonwealth. Drawing inspiration from our pre-1987 heritage and the exemplary low conflict models of South Africa and Botswana, the amendment to Section 902 confronts the foundational cause of perennial electoral strife, attenuating political violence and destabilization perils as witnessed in Mozambique's 2024 and Tanzania's 2025 direct presidential contest. Let me explain a little bit here. From 1980, we didn't have a direct presidential election. So you encounter people who start telling you that we went to war for direct universal suffrage to elect our president. You are reversing the gains of the liberation struggle. That is total rubbish. Nobody went to war for one man, one vote. We were never colonized coming from a position of one man, one vote. Nobody. We were coming from a position where we had chiefs. But we went to war because the colonizer took our land and our rights. And we wanted to liberate ourselves from the colonizer so that we can govern and decide how we govern. Hence, from 1980 to 1990, we never had a direct presidential election. Those that are old enough, 1989 is the year of the people's power. That is how it was going. And when we went to elections, ZANU-PF formed a government because it had a majority and it proposed a prime minister to the president then. And it was the same in 1985. So you encounter some people who would tell you that if you vote for MPs, it equates to a position of no universal electoral suffrage. Yet the very authors of one man, one vote or of elections, they don't have direct elections. In the UK, for instance, you vote for your MPs, the majority party proposes a prime minister and the monarch approves. In America, they have electoral colleges. In Germany, they have indirect elections. And what we are saying is, ever since we introduced the direct elections, there was toxicity around one individual. If you look at all the elections that were very toxic, it was never about an MP, the presidential election. The 2008 one, the rerun, very toxic. Direct. If you look at 2018, the demonstrations and the shootings, it had nothing to do with the MPs in Harare. Nobody cared about the MPs in Harare. It was direct presidential election. Nobody even cared that ZANU-PF had 2/3. They were fighting that you stole our election, but in parliament ZANU-PF had a majority. You stole our election. So we looked at this and said, we are told that Botswana is a model of democracy. They don't have direct elections. Even in South Africa. Even the scenario that happened in 2008, for instance, when we were doing our studies to say, how do we implement to the book what the resolution said, but translating to an operative document that satisfies the tenets of government, we looked at the 2008 elections and we said, if we didn't have direct elections, we would have avoided what happened in the rerun. If I was in ZANU-PF, then I would negotiate with Welsh and say, let's form a government. In the same mold that Cyril did in South Africa. He went to bed with DA and they formed a government. Nobody died. So they will tell you that we want people to die by having a direct election. That's what they are saying. They are not concerned about people. They may lie. We are Africans, one. We never had elections. We went to war to liberate ourselves so that atirambizi kufamba muna first. Atirambizi kuita mama minja yedu yanga yatorwa anyway. So that we if you listen to Tongo's speech, he says, I don't care whether I'm on upper echelons. All I want, I'm dying, is for my child to sit together and be equals. That was the messaging. So mchavanzwa maovheti akanyuka paindependence vakuenda mabhesi vamwe vacho vachitaura kuti haiwa universal suffrage, one man one vote yakauya 1980. So I just wanted to clear that, so that when you ask them questions, they answer you, but how where did they learn about universal suffrage? If they say England, you say, but England, they vote for the MPs, they propose a prime minister, the monarch, the King Charles, who endorsed. In America, it's worse. I don't even understand the electoral college system. It's a thieving electoral college system. You see? So that's how it is. So, parliamentary election of the president will insulate the office of the president from divisive rancor, galvanize national cohesion, and revitalize Zimbabwe's democratic ethos, elevating our nation as Africa's paragon of serene power transitions. The amended Section 92 will also enable diaspora voting through consequential amendments to the Electoral Act, as electors will focus solely on MPs and councillors in constituencies and wards respectively. So it becomes very easy. These cornerstone reforms are buttressed by synergistic enhancements, including the augmentation of the Senate under Section 120 from 80 to 90 members, the inclusion of 10 ex-officio experts who infuse diversity and specialized acumen, expanding the ministerial reservoir and mitigating polarization to fortify parliamentary democracy. Then amendments to Section 239 on voter registration will depoliticize the voter's role, rationalize what has already been happening, therefore codifying established practices, while the Independent Delimitation Commission will forestall gerrymandering, ensure equitable electoral demarcations. In conclusion, this bill dismantles entrenched impediments through a potent triad: indirect presidential election to neutralize toxicity, that's one; a 7-year electoral cycle to prioritize development and inclusive government structures, that's two; or executable under Section 328, subsection 5, without the divisiveness of referendums. This legislative masterpiece immortalizes President Mnangagwa's legacy, heralding the Second Republic as a constitutional renaissance that bridges our storied past with limitless horizons beyond 2030. So I urge you, let us embrace this transformative vision, for in its realization lies Zimbabwe's unyielding ascent to prosperity and unity. I thank you. I will give you an electronic copy. I will give it to you. You will circulate so you can also read it at your spare time and you crystallize some of the issues. So I thought I should prepare this with my team so that we can clarify firstly to the editors, because if you are well equipped, you'll be able now to control the narrative, to ask the relevant questions, to even ask me also the relevant questions, so that it becomes very clear. So I thank you for listening. Yes.
I would say from what you gave us, a lot of things are quite clear, and you also even refer to what they have been and what it means now. So from your perspective, what is fueling the discussion and debate? I know it's healthy, but it's leaning more towards the negative. There's so much, I don't know if I must call it noise, about this constitutional amendment on the social media and everywhere. So from your perspective, what could be fueling this? Is it because it's tied with resolution number 1, so people think it's all about resolution number 1, or it's what? Lack of understanding, or I don't know, party politics, or not party politics, but politics in general. So I want to hear from your perspective what you think is really fueling this. Thank you.
You want me to answer?
Yeah.
I think it's in two parts. Firstly, there are those that are just there and paid to oppose what government does. First of all, they always find a way, even if you say something, they'll say, where you put a comma, I don't think it's correct, and they can even make a headline to say where the comma was, it's wrong, because that's in their nature. Then secondly, there are those that have been misinterpreting the Constitution. failing to distinguish what a term limit provision is and an electoral cycle. That's why I took my time to say this term, which started in 2023, if the incumbent vacates, one who comes does not start a cycle that will be ascribed to him, who will be saying, no, elections will be there after 5 years. Even if an MP, look, a good example is, if you go into the constitution, to say the lifespan of parliament is a 5-year term, which lasts midnight before the next election, and it commences when the president is sworn in. In other words, when you are elected, you are just an MP elect. You wait for the president to be sworn in. As soon as he is sworn in, your 5-year cycle starts. When he declares that elections will be on the 3rd of August, midnight before 3rd of August, you cease to be an MP. But you can still contest and come back. So those provisions are exactly the same that govern the member of parliament to those that govern the presidential. So there are those that are conflating the electoral cycle to the term limit provision. That's why I gave an example that if His Excellency appoints a permanent secretary today, we'll start counting the time. If we go to an election, you'll still be a permanent secretary. When 5 years lapse, then they cease by operation of law. And the president has a discretion to appoint you for another 5 years. After the next 5 years, you can't. So it's by operation. It has a determinable beginning and a determinable end. The presidential tenure in office, that's why you see the wording of Section 91 on qualification to be a president. It will then require now the electoral body to say, hang on, what we describe as a term for the purposes of allowing you to contest is 3 or more years. So if the cycle continues because of something that happened and you could not vacate office and you do 6 years, it will still be considered a term. And then you can contest another term. So those that there is misinterpretation and on the face of it, admittedly, if you look at it on the face of it, we have terribly violated the Constitution. But if you study it carefully, you will then realize that this is not a term limit provision. And we were helped by the Mpungu case, where they challenged the Chief Justice's age limit to say that by allowing him to get to 75, we had extended his term. And it was argued very well that this age is not unlike a term limit. In fact, about the Chief Justice being a constitutional court, it says 15 years, you vacate. Or if you get to 70. So in other words, if you are appointed and you are 69, at 70 you are vacating. If I am appointed and I'm 50, I would leave at 65. My years will be 15, which is the actual term. Determinable beginning, determinable end. Age, it's not, people are appointed with having different ages. So the time they are in office is not fixed if you look at age. So I think it's in 2 parts. Lack of appreciation of the constitutional provisions, and also those that are paid to just rubbish everything without having regard, and those that make a living out of it. I know couple of lawyers are making money in town by making applications to the court. That's democracy.
Yeah, Honorable Minister. Yeah, I think from your presentation, it has now become apparently clear that there is no need for a referendum. But out there, the contentious issue right now, as we are speaking, is the issue of the referendum. Is it that our learned friends are deliberately, like you said, choosing to ignore this? Or surely there is an explanation that needs to be done?
That's why I hurriedly accepted your request to meet you so that you can ask them, this is how it is. Why are you saying there's need for a referendum? Because to me, there is conflation of an electoral cycle with term limit.
To add to that, Honorable Minister, because even those that are celebrated as the best teachers of constitutional law in our law schools are also getting it wrong.
They are also political actors. You know, I'm more or less the same age with one of the professors. My daughter is finishing law at UZ, and she always laughs and says, Professor tells us that listen to the professor in class. Don't listen to the politician professor.
Wow.
So he tries to differentiate himself from the professor that will be teaching students law and the professor that will be there was a famous professor, Vamgabe he would say,